Law578 Law of Evidence 2, the topic on documentary evidence, lecture 1. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In this lecture, I am going to explain to you the law relating to documentary evidence under the Evidence Act 1950, and the discussion on documentary evidence can be separated into several parts. In this first video, I am going to explain to you the definition of documents and the scope of documentary evidence. Later, in subsequent videos, there will be discussion on primary and secondary documents, public and private documents, and lastly, with regards to computer or electronic evidence. Okay, before we look at the definition of document and the scope of documentary evidence, right? Previously, we know that when we talk about evidence that you tender in the court, basically there are three forms of evidence. Say, for example, you have a situation where A killed B. So this is a public prosecutor. The public prosecutor may want to produce evidence in the court. The form of evidence that a prosecutor can tender in the court will be number one, a form of a witness. So the prosecutor may call a witness, say for example C, who saw A stab B. C will be a witness that will be produced in the court. So the first form of evidence will be the form of a person who will be giving oral evidence in the court. So when you refer to Section 3 of the Evidence Act, any statement made by a person relating to an evidence in the court, so it's going to be taken on oath. So this particular person is basically giving an oral evidence in the court. So when C here testifies in the court orally as to what he perceived, he has to comply with Section 60 of the Evidence Act, in which his evidence has to be what he perceived by senses. The second form of evidence, basically, when you talk about documentary evidence. So documentary evidence is also explained in Section 3 of the Evidence Act, in which evidence include all documents produced for the inspection of the court. Such documents are called documentary evidence. So, say for example, B, has written a diary. In the diary basically provides of the fact that B has been stalked by A, and A may have been making threatening calls to B. So this particular diary can be produced as evidence in the court. Of course, the diary is a documentary evidence. The production of diary, it has to be an original document, because that will be the primary evidence. So the diary can be produced in the court. However, with regards to the content of a diary, it's going to be a different issue, because the truth of the content of the diary must be proven by the person who made it. And if B here is dead, so this diary becomes hearsay evidence. So when you are going to produce the fact that if you are going to produce an evidence that the diary indeed exists, so that will be the production of documentary evidence, and it can be allowed. So it's going to be one form of evidence that you are going to tender. The third form of evidence, which is not provided in Section 3 of the Evidence Act, is actually in the form of real or physical evidence. So if, for example, A killed B by stabbing, and there is a knife, the tendering of the knife here will be the tendering of real or physical evidence, because this knife is actually the murder weapon. So if you have facts and issue relates to drug cases, so the drug that you produce in the court will amounting to tendering of real and physical evidence, whereby this particular drug is tended to show or being the subject matter of the facts in issue. Now, having said that, sometimes there have been instances where documentary evidence can also be tendered as a form of real or physical evidence. If you look at the notes here, right, there have been cases where a document has been produced to reflect real and physical evidence. For example, there have been the tendering of airline tickets as real and physical evidence. There are also pieces of paper that has been tendered to show real and physical evidence. And later when we discuss about perhaps CCTV, which capture the image of an accused person sneaking into the house of the victim, the CCTV here, if you are tendering it as evidence in the court, of course it's going to be in the form of documentary evidence. However, it is real physical evidence because it captures the image of the accused person. It captures incident as to what transpired at that time. So that will be the tendering of real physical evidence, even though it may be documentary, in a documentary form. Now, what is actually document? So document is actually one of the forms of evidence that can be tendered in the court. Now, Section 3 basically defines document to mean any matter expressed, described, or howsoever represented upon any substance, material, things, or article, including any matter embodied in a disc, tape, film, soundtrack, or other device whatsoever by means of A, letters, figures, etc., B, any visual recording, C, any sound recording, D, any recording or transmission or any part of that, and it is used for the purpose of expressing, describing, or howsoever representing that matter. So if you look at the definition of document here, it can be said that documentary evidence can be defined in situation where you have to ask the first question, where is this particular statement located? So you are talking about basically statement. Where is this particular statement located? So if the statement is located either in a piece of paper or in a disc or in a handphone or CCTV, that could be part of documentary evidence. And this particular statement contain what? Yeah, it may be able to express or describe or representing something. So you have one piece of paper and there is something written on it. What is written on it may be an expression or description or representation of something. So that combination of paper plus the content which tend to express, describe, or represent may be regarded as tendering of documentary evidence. And the third part or the third characteristic of documentary evidence is how is it embodied. It can embody letters, symbol, marks, visual recordings, visual recordings or audio recordings. So meaning to say that if you have one piece of document, one piece of item, it can be regarded as a documentary evidence if it can contain something, it can express something, or it can embody something, right? Well, how will this be so? I give you an example. Right? Say you have A has been murdered by B, and you found there is a brick, right? There is a brick that was found near the dead body, and the brick basically okay, this is a situation where you are basically tendering a real and physical evidence. So the brick, you found blood on it. So this brick, if it is tendered, it is amounting to the tendering of real and physical evidence. If you have a piece of brick or a piece of stone that has inscription on it, so there is an inscription, maybe something that, or a symbol, right, to reflect perhaps some kind of agreement between A and B, the tendering of this particular brick here, so this brick here now, if it is produced as evidence in the court, may satisfy the definition of it being a documentary evidence, because on this brick you find a symbol, and this symbol may be reflecting an agreement between A and B, right? And it is actually located on a brick, right? So in this situation, even though it may be a brick, but there is some inscription or symbol on it, and there's some meaning to it, So this particular brick, if it is tendered as evidence in the court, it may be tendered as a form of documentary evidence. Yeah. Or if you have a situation where A killed B and B, prior to his death, wrote down on the floor, A killed me, yeah, using his blood. You take photo of this particular inscription on the floor. The tendering of the photo will be the tendering of a documentary evidence. If this piece of plank, for example, if A made the writing on a piece of plank or on a piece of paper, this plank, if it is tendered as evidence in the court, it will be produced as a form of documentary evidence, because this particular plank has symbol in it, has inscription in it, so it has some letters on it. It is on the piece of plank, right? And it expresses something, or it describes something, or it may represent something. So this particular plank in which A wrote Ali A killed me can be tendered as evidence in the court to reflect, and this evidence will be in a form of documentary evidence. Okay, so this is actually documentary evidence. Now, bear in mind, when you are tendering evidence in the court, as I told you earlier, that document can either be real or physical evidence. So how do you distinguish when can an evidence be tendered to reflect real and physical evidence, and when can evidence be tendered to reflect documentary evidence? Now, if you look at the lecture notes here, if a document tendered is marked as exhibit as real evidence, then the real evidence, the document, so it is a piece of document, but it is produced as a real evidence, you cannot rely on the content of it as if it is a documentary evidence unless it satisfies the requirement of allowing you to produce it as documentary evidence. So what happened in example in the case of Portcullis Trustnet Singapore, this is actually talking about a logo which is on a piece of paper. So the issue here is whether this logo on a piece of paper here is actually document or the tendering of real physical evidence. This is a case which is actually on the breach of copyright. So someone has been using this particular logo, whether this is amounting to a breach of copyright. So the evidence that the party is producing is actually the logo itself, which is on a piece of paper. So will the tendering of the logo on a piece of paper here is amounting to tendering of a documentary evidence or amounting to the tendering of real physical evidence? The court in this case says that when this particular piece of paper that have logo on it is tendered as evidence in the court, it is basically tendering it as a form of real physical evidence. So the logo there, when it is tendered, it is not in a form of documentary evidence. However, it is actually the form of real physical evidence. So it means that you have to ask the question, why are you tendering it? Are you going to tender it for the purpose of looking at the content of it? Then it can be part of it can be part of tendering of a documentary evidence. If you tender this particular document, right, for the purpose of it being a real physical evidence, for example, just now as a copyright that directly relates to the facts and issue, then you are producing the document actually in a form of real and physical evidence. Yeah. Similarly, if you have CCTV situation, CCTV which capture the image of an incident that transpired on a particular day, the tendering of the CCTV therefore is amounting to the tendering of real physical as to what transpired on that particular day. So it's not going to be regarded as real physical evidence. Okay, it is not going to be regarded as a documentary evidence, even though production of the CCTV is actually you have to comply with the law on documentary evidence on the production of electronic evidence. So basically, when you refer to the notes here, a document can be tendered to reflect real and physical evidence if it is to show that it exists which relates to the ongoing incident, which relates to the facts and issue. For example, just now, if it is a copyright, you have a symbol, there's a breach of copyright, so the logo is subject matter of the facts and issue, so you are tendering the logo as real physical evidence. So a document can be tendered as documentary evidence if the aim of you to tender this particular document is actually to look into the content of this particular document. If your aim is to look at the content of the particular document, then you are basically producing a documentary evidence. Okay? Now, so if you have a document and you are going to produce it as evidence in the court as a form of documentary evidence, you have to satisfy the document, you have to prove the document as an evidence in the court. So there's a need for you to basically have the document properly proved. For a document to be properly proved, you have to ask a question. Number one, whether your document is a public or private document. Number two, whether your document is primary or secondary document, or whether your document is a computer printout, electronic or computer evidence, because each and every one forms of evidence here may have different law that need to be satisfied in terms of proving it as evidence in the court. Alright, so this video will basically stops here because it aims only to explain to you the definition of document, the scope of documentary evidence, and the distinction between real physical evidence with documentary evidence. In the next video, I am going to explain to you on primary and secondary documents.